section. This is about the June 2014 draft guidance for industry providing submissions in electronic formats. The question, will this regulation require attachments such as literature attachments to be electronic, or is the physical media still acceptable?
I could pull the guidance right out, but first I urge you to check the guidance, but it's my understanding that ICSR attachments must come in electronically as well, but please either write us or check the guidance on that. But our goal really is to move away from paper. It's long overdue, these big stacks of paper. But yeah, I think it all has to come in electronically, but check the guidance.
Yes.
Penny Levin, Teva Pharmaceuticals. Thank you. Will sponsors submitting biosimilar applications to the FDA be able to use products approved in foreign countries as reference products? And a follow-up to that, will a bridging study to a U.S. reference be required?
Okay, for the first question, the law requires that the biosimilar applicant be referencing a U.S.-approved biosimilar product. So you can't reference a non-U.S. approved biologic product for your biosimilar application. So that's the question number one. That's addressed in the statute. We have done a lot of work over the last several years to understand how to utilize data that may have been generated using non-U.S. approved biologics to help support biosimilar applications. And we are open to utilizing those data in appropriate circumstances where we have appropriate bridging information. So we ask for information about analytic comparisons between the non-U.S. reference product and the U.S. product and the biosimilar product. We look for comparative PK data and maybe comparative pharmacodynamic data if there's an appropriate marker for that biologic. So we are open to utilizing those data, but you can't use a non-U.S. licensed biologic as your reference product. But we have been open to using data collected for non-U.S. reference biologic products with the appropriate bridging information.
Thank you.
Can I just have a follow-up to that last answer I gave about attachments? What we say here is that physical media is a backup method, and we say this isn't a draft guidance. On occasion, it may be necessary to send an ICSR and/or an ICSR attachment in electronic format to FDA using appropriate physical media. FDA recommends that physical media be used only as a backup method for electronic submission of ICSRs when the electronic submission gateway is down for more than 48 hours. And there's an email here you can contact about submissions regarding details.
And if I could add to my answer about the bridging data, these get into very, very complicated scenarios. So if you have a particular case you're working on, it's very important that the sponsor meet with FDA to get guidance on the particular circumstance. So while we're open to bridging to non-U.S. licensed biologics for biosimilar applications, it gets very complicated, and it's very important to not just assume that your interpretation of the bridging is adequate. You should come in and request a biologic product development meeting under the biosimilar user fee program. I can tell you we've seen lots of situations where sponsors have assumed their interpretation of bridging would be adequate, and we found it wholly inadequate. And you've had to go, sponsors have been told they needed to repeat studies, and that can delay your program. So it's very important to take advantage of the biosimilar product development meetings, BPD meetings, to come in and get advice on what you're proposing before you do the studies.
Okay, anyone else have more comments? Okay, I have a question that could be for Justina or John or Sandy or Christine. I think, Gerald, you got a break this time, but maybe not. More and more companies are outsourcing to Asia. Clinical services directly or via CROs. And the growth of phase 1 units in India is an example. How does the agency plan to oversee and enforce regulatory compliance when at times the country's own regulatory compliance internally is in doubt? The issues with informed consent in India is an example.
Well, I believe that just because the studies are done in another country doesn't mean that they aren't inspected. You know, we have a series of inspections under our Office of Scientific Investigation, and they look at clinical trial studies and monitor various sites for problems. The issue of informed consent, I'm not sure how we would deal with that, but that's, you know, a CRO would most likely be involved in these trials, and they would have to comply, I imagine, with whatever guidance comes out of the Office of New Drugs for that. So I turn it to John.
Well, if the product is being developed for a marketing application for the U.S., either under an IND or not under an IND, the sponsor is going to be responsible for making sure that they meet the regulatory requirements, the Declaration of Helsinki requirements for informed consent, the requirements for record keeping, and all the other compliance activities. So the burden falls to the sponsor, and then the second burden falls to the agency to ensure compliance. So one of the mechanisms we ensure compliance is you have to certify when you submit the application or the data that you've met all the applicable standards for human protection and good clinical practices. And then we have, as Justina said, the ability to inspect studies as necessary to try to ensure that they actually do meet the standards. That said, we generally don't inspect a lot of phase 1 study results because we have limited capacity, but again, that burden falls to the sponsor of the application. You are certifying when you submit the data to the FDA that you've met all those applicable standards, and if you have not appropriately ensured that you're meeting those standards, you can be subject to enforcement action. So a lot of this burden falls on the sponsor to make sure that they're following the appropriate regulations and laws in these areas.